Suffragettes of Smith County, Texas. During the Republic of Texas, early statehood, and the Confederacy, the question of women voting never came up. Women's property rights gradually developed, but not their political rights. Woman suffrage was proposed during the Reconstruction Constitutional Convention of 1868, but was defeated. The 1875 Texas Constitution, the one we still use, although much amended, excluded idiots, lunatics, paupers, felons, and women from voting. Men who were not yet citizens could vote, as long as they had declared their intention to become citizens. It was called voting on first papers. However, women who were American citizens, college-educated women, women ranchers, women business owners, women taxpayers, could not vote on anything that affected their lives. The 1880s and 1890s saw the rise of the women's club movement in the United States, including Texas and including Tyler. They joined literary clubs, church groups, charities, heritage groups, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women began to organize, hold study groups, and make plans to improve their communities and protect their families. Greater numbers of women went to college. They became frustrated when they voiced concerns and were patted on the head or ignored completely. In 1893, the grandmother of women's suffrage in Tyler stepped forward, Mary Louise McKellar Herndon. President of the Northeast Division of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was among many who signed a call for a convention to meet in Dallas to organize an equal suffrage association for Texas and to elect delegates to the World's Fair Convention of the National American Suffrage Association. Mary Louise at that time was 53 years old, a pre-Civil War graduate of Baylor, while it was still in independence, the wife of a former congressman, the mother of 8 grown children, and a leading member of First Baptist Church. Her home was where the YMCA is now, downtown. Mary Louise was elected 3rd vice president of the state organization and an alternate to the national convention. They worked toward getting a bill introduced into the Texas House 2 years later in 1895, but it never made it out of committee. The state women's organization subsequently had a disagreement and died. Mary Louise, however, kept the proposal alive in East Texas. Equal suffrage was plank number 2 in the Women's Christian Temperance Union platform in 1898. She believed that if women could vote, they would vote for prohibition, and that would help families. There was another short-lived state-level group and another failed constitutional amendment, and then finally, in the spring of 1913, San Antonio suffragettes issued a call for delegates to gather to try again. On March 27th, Mary Louise, now a widow, invited anyone interested in the cause to meet at her home to organize the Smith County Equal Suffrage League. 32 women and men attended, including Rabbi Maurice Faber, the Reverend George Platt from Christ Episcopal, and Dr. W.F. Andrews from Marvin. The first president of the organization was Bertie Johnson. Mrs. Cone Johnson, 45, a former state president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, president of the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, an early member of the Daughters of the American Revolution here, and a member of the first board of regents of what would become Texas Woman's University. Mary Louise Herndon's youngest daughter was chosen to attend the state meeting, and her middle daughter, Elizabeth Herndon Potter, began contributing an equal franchise column to the Tyler paper, reporting on state and national developments. By the time the Equal Franchise League met the next month, membership was up to 56. At that meeting, Miss Frankie Bothwell read a British suffragette play entitled How the Vote Was Won. I've got a copy, and it's entertaining but very pointed. Mary Louise was also pointed when she submitted a strongly worded rebuttal to an article in the Baptist Standard that claimed that women didn't want the vote. In April of 1914, the state organization met at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas. Mary Louise's oldest daughter, Mary Herndon Gray, along with Mrs. L.S. Small, attended as Smith County's delegates, representing now 72 members. Elizabeth Herndon Potter spoke to the convention saying, "The reason we want the feminine way of thinking directly expressed at the ballot box is because it is so different from the masculine method of approach toward any subject. It has always been so and always will be so. It is not antagonistic. It merely rounds out the other half of the circle of life. Child labor, compulsory education, pure food, laws regulating the sale of cocaine and cigarettes to minors, imagine that, cocaine to minors, laws governing the age of consent, the censorship of places of amusement, the care of juvenile delinquents, employers' liability laws, laws providing for the payment of prisoners for their labor, the wages to go to their families, are all matters which ought to interest and do interest many mothers. Our problem is to show women that they can get state help along these lines more fully, more easily, more quickly with the ballot than without it." Unfortunately, later that same month, Bertie Johnson left Tyler for a while when her husband took a position with the State Department in Washington. That left the local suffrage organization even more in the hands of the Herndon women and Belle McFarland, the wife of a local banker, and enthusiasm lagged. In late December, Elizabeth wrote headquarters, "Tyler is a discouraging place. People so enthusiastic over a thing for a short time, but it lacks continuity of effort. One must constantly pull them out of a slough of despond." But 1915 was a legislative year in Austin, and so it was time to push again for legislation. Tyler never had a suffrage march. No woman ever chained herself to a tree downtown or starved herself. Tyler was too conservative for that, and the ladies knew that they would antagonize more voters, all of course men, with those tactics than they might win. Instead, they turned to educational speakers who would convince men with logic. Helen Todd of San Francisco, chairman of the League of Western Women Voters, spoke in Tyler on January 20th, 1915, hitting the Cotton Belt offices, the Cotton Belt shops, so that both management and labor, she talked to both, Tyler Commercial College, Tyler High School, and in the evening she spoke at the beautiful old courthouse, with 300 people turned away due to lack of room. The ladies passed out subscription cards so that the audience can indicate its attitude toward the cause. And they took up a free will offering to cover expenses. Notice the map and what has been handwritten across the top. Out west, they treat us white. Of course, that can be taken two ways. The states on the map that are white allowed women to vote. But this slogan also pointed out that while the local white women might consider themselves very progressive about their own voting rights, they still had a long way to go before they would care to extend equal rights to their African American neighbors. Smith County ladies also worked on petitions to send to Austin, ending up with 375 men's names and 215 women's names. Mary Louise Herndon, now 74, secured the most names of voters to the petition. That's her name right at the top. Less than a week later, on the 26th, the women topped it off with some new technology, a silent movie called Your Girl and Mine, an 8-reeler to be shown at the Electric Palace on the west side of the square. This movie had been produced by and for suffragettes to show the evils that befall women without the vote. It has been called the Uncle Tom's Cabin of women's suffrage, weaving together politics and melodrama. I contacted the Library of Congress, and unfortunately, no copy survives. Here's one still photo. 2 days after that, Elizabeth Herndon Potter spoke in Austin for women's votes. There seems to be opposition to giving women the vote right to vote because it is claimed they would spend too much time upon matters apart from the home. I think it would be much better if we had suffrage and had legislative matters for the women to think of instead of having them play bridge. She wrote her older sister back home in Tyler, "Send more women's names to me or Miss Finnegan, if you have any. Get heaps of personal letters written to people asking them to ask their men for submission. Do. We have 10 days to 2 weeks. It's up to the women of Texas to show men they do want this. The enemy is working hard. We have appealed to the sense of fair play and democracy in vain. Some say we are going to strangle it here." And they did kill it. Women had to get men to vote a 2/3 majority for the constitutional amendment to pass. Pauline Wells of Brownsville spoke against it in the legislature. Pro-liquor interests, realizing that most of the Texas suffragettes were also prohibitionists, voted it down on February 23rd. Texas women and Tyler women did not give up. About 6 weeks later, Elizabeth Herndon Potter welcomed another national speaker to Tyler. Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, spoke to about 250 at Tyler High School auditorium. This illustration is from the Alcalde, the high school yearbook that's in the Smith County Historical Society archives. The suffragettes charged for attendance this time, trying to raise funds to send to Austin, but they lost money on the talk because it was scheduled for Good Friday and there were too many other things going on. Again, without the legislature in session, the cause faded. In October of 1915, Potter wrote state headquarters that our organization has not met since last April, I think. We have only a half dozen who will come, so I'm discouraged. I don't know what to do to keep their interest. She attended Equal Suffrage Day at the State Fair in Dallas with a large luncheon at the Adolphus. She seems to have despaired of any action on the state level, and by January she was a national legislative committeeman, lobbying Washington for a national suffrage amendment whenever she could. Please emphasize that our great enemy in getting it by states is not the anti-suffragists of the people, but the dollars of the distilleries and breweries. These booze dollars will buy 11 senators in Texas, and then no amendment can get to the people. I lobbied for the suffrage amendment in Texas, and I know we fought booze-controlled farmers' union, booze-controlled labor, booze-controlled railroads, etc. I found the unclean trace in the analysis of the ballot of most opponents. As far as Tyler went, she wrote, "My town has been dead to suffrage. Only protracted meetings thrive in Tyler. An itinerant evangelist can take from $1,200 to $1,300 out of town with 10 days of whooping it up, but a dime is a limit on other interests. All are dead here except me and you. I have to use a respirator to find a suffrage breath." In November of 1916, with another legislature coming up in January, Minnie Fisher Cunningham, the president of the state organization, came to Smith County to speak at the courthouse, Tyler Commercial College, at the district rally of the Women's Benefit Association of the Maccabees, and also at noonday, where she attracted a crowd of 200, Swan and Lindale. All men and all women who believed Texas women ought to vote were again invited to join the Smith County Equal Franchise League, with the annual dues waived. The only requirement was a pledge that you will think suffrage, talk suffrage, give to suffrage as you can. Votes for women is the biggest question before the American people today, a movement that is sweeping like wildfire over the whole land. In January, Ludi Starnes of Wisconsin spoke in the district courtroom and at the high school. Suffrage opponents had cited several oppositions. Those who couldn't fight in wars shouldn't vote. If the amendment passed, African American women would vote, and so would bad women. According to the newspaper, in the first excuse, she called attention to the hundreds of men rejected by the recruiting stations who did not thereby lose their votes. In the second excuse, the Negro population of Texas is only 17% of the whole. The third excuse, that bad women usually use fictitious names and for that reason seldom register or vote. Ms. Starnes said that there were 9 questions of utmost importance that women ought to vote upon: child labor, compulsory education, the Red Light and Abatement Act, the age of consent, prohibition, minimum wage, equal guardianship of the child, and the hours of working women. Again, Elizabeth Herndon Potter had petitions passed among the people for signatures to send to our legislators asking for submission to the people of an amendment favoring equal suffrage. The Texas House voted 76 to 56 for the amendment, but that was less than 2/3, so it failed. Potter wrote into the Tyler paper, "We know there is far more suffrage sentiment in Texas today than there was 2 years ago. We know that we have worked harder, sacrificed more. We know that our opponents have spent many thousand against us. We know that they can work from the inside and we from the outside, but we are not downhearted. The same forces that rule Texas, though it boasts of 187 dry counties, fight relentlessly the woman's vote. Truth often loses a battle, but never loses a war." In April of 1917, the United States entered World War I, and on April the 3rd, the Smith County Equal Franchise League tendered its services to President Wilson. Women's attention in Tyler and elsewhere shifted to support for the armed forces with Women's War Savings Committees, Liberty Loans, Red Cross work, and food production and conservation, including chickens, but that was another story. Suffrage leaders made a conscious decision to focus more on the war, to prove the value of women and their leadership to the country, to prove they had earned the right to full participation in political life. But as they worked on the home front, they still managed to keep their cause in public view. In May, Florence Brown Cottenham, a native Tylerite but now a leading suffragette of Little Rock, came home to Texas to speak for women's vote. In July, the Dallas Morning News ran a large article entitled "Pioneer Women of Texas Interested in Suffrage." One of the featured grandmothers was Mary Louise Herndon of Tyler, now 76. And women also managed to work behind the scenes, helping to get Governor Paul Ferguson, who was pro-liquor and anti-women's suffrage, impeached. He was replaced by Governor William P. Hobby, who was pro-suffrage. Indeed, his future wife was Ovida Culp Hobby, so you know he was not afraid of strong women. Bertie Johnson had returned to Tyler in the spring, and by fall she was again the president of the Smith County Equal Franchise League. First vice president was Elizabeth Herndon Potter, second vice president was Belle McFarland, and third vice president was Annie McClendon. Attention shifted to the National Suffrage Amendment, and state headquarters sent out letters to prominent women in Tyler, Lindale, Swan, Starville, Bullard, Troup, and Winona, urging them to write to their congressmen that 1. We want to be full citizens of the United States. 2. Because we respond to every call of duty to our nation that men respond to. 3. Because we bear the cost of government in taxation and in political control. 4. Because we need the power that a vote gives to protect our labor and the regulation of our lives. 5. Because the Democratic Party, which voted 8-1 for equal suffrage in St. Louis in 1916, did not fulfill that pledge in the Texas legislature on March 6, 1917. 6. Because a state campaign forces us to appeal to Negro men to raise us to their political status. 7. A state campaign also forces us to appeal in Spanish to thousands of illiterate and alien Mexicans who in Texas vote on papers of first intention. 8. A state campaign also forces us to campaign amongst the ultra-conservative German towns whose citizens are averse to giving women any recognition in government. Our enfranchisement will enormously increase the white supremacy of Texas and give an impetus toward the best ideals of American democracy. The state would, of course, ratify the federal amendment and prescribe conditions suitable to our state and conformable to the U.S. Constitution. Finally, we want to vote for President Wilson if he decides to be a third-term war president. On March 8, 1918, Elizabeth Herndon Potter received a letter from President Wilson, which she published widely. He wrote, "I feel it a privilege to express my earnest hope that the legislature of Texas may see its way to adopt a statute which will give women a right to vote in the primaries, only the primaries. The Democratic Party is so clearly committed to the principle of woman suffrage that I feel it my duty as a leader of the party to urge this action by the legislature, and it is also a privilege which I value to yield to my own personal convictions in this matter and urge such action on its merits. I sincerely hope that the measure may become law." Allowing women to vote in the primaries required only a majority vote, and it would give Democratic women almost full voting rights in our one-party state. It neatly sidestepped the whole issue of black women voting because the Democratic primary was at that point, by law, whites only. Texas law had already pretty much taken out poor women because of the $1.50 per person poll tax. That doesn't sound like much, but a sharecropper family living on credit at the store might not have $1.50 cash just for the wife to be able to vote. The primary bill passed the House 84-34 and in the Senate 18-4. It was then signed by Governor Hobby, and Texas women thereby became eligible to participate in primaries only. They had only 17 days to register in order to vote in the very next election, and across Texas, 386,000 women did just that. Bertie Johnson, president of the Smith County Equal Franchise League, appeared at the Tyler Courthouse at 8 a.m. on the first day, becoming the very first woman registered to vote in Smith County history. The league planned weekly schools of citizenship to educate women on the manner and methods of voting and to drum up interest in getting registered. Local officials made arrangements to register women out in Lindale, Winona, Swan, Bullard, Noonday, Flint, Pine Springs, Garden Valley, Arp, and Troop. Democratic Party leaders encouraged women to get involved and provided candidates to meet with groups. The July 12th Tyler newspaper announced that 1,265 women had registered by that point. On July 31st, 1918, the Courier-Times reported the complete returns of Democratic primaries for Smith County. They said it was a valuable table if for no other reason it contains the first vote cast by women in Smith County. They estimated that approximately 3,000 women voted in the primary last Saturday. Of this number, fully 1,500 registered in the city of Tyler. However, Texas women could still not vote in general elections. The federal constitutional amendment failed again in September. When the legislature met in January of 1919, Governor Hobby supported a state constitutional amendment that would both give women the right to vote and which would strip voting rights from persons of foreign birth who had only filed first papers. Remember that we were just out of a war with Germany, and there were stories circulating of German immigrants in Texas who had used their foreign status to avoid the draft, but who were still allowed to vote, even when American citizen women could not. The amendment passed the legislature and was sent to the voters, the all-male voters, of course, for approval. Tenny Hughes, wife of the Tyler city attorney, wrote Suffrage Headquarters, "We are anxious for some conspicuous posters or stickers to hang and fly from places or points of vantage. If you have anything of the kind, kindly send me several hundred. Have you any suggestions about the final day or two before Election Day and Election Day? Any cards that may be handed out on that day, etc.? A note on the letter indicated that they had sent 36 big posters with babies. Perhaps this one. 24, Woman's Hour has struck. 50 Better Babies, 50 Woman's Interests, 10 ballot posters, and 50 maps. Another petition was sent around. The Smith County women want the suffrage. It has been demonstrated by a petition which asked the men of the county to vote yes on the amendment. 1,015 women have thus registered their interest and their belief in self-government. Tirelessly, the women of the county have interviewed to get together this list of names, and the petition represents only 3 weeks' work. Margaret Glenn, wife of the head of Tyler Commercial College, county chairman of the suffrage forces, in commenting upon the petition said, "We have had such a short period for our campaign that we have not been able to interview all our county women. We have found them wonderfully interested, and 90% of them have been willing to go on record by signing our petition. Smith County has never been found wanting in the support of democratic measures, and our men have always considered our wishes when they felt we were anxious for their support. We are depending upon them to heed our appeal now and to vote yes on the woman's suffrage amendment May 24th. The amendment easily passed in Tyler, 763 to 399, or 2-1, but it failed in most of the rural precincts. On the county level, it barely squeaked by, 1,861 to 1,825. It failed on the state level by 25,000 votes, largely in the high immigrant counties where non-citizen men would have been voting to give up their own voting rights, which of course they did not do. Anti-prohibition forces also played a role, as well as men who just didn't think that women should be able to vote. Let their husbands vote for them. A little over a week later, the federal constitutional amendment was sent to states for approval. It stated, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." The Texas legislature, already in special session, decided to vote on it despite the fact that women's suffrage had just failed a statewide vote. Suffrage leaders emphasized that the measure had been defeated because it was tied to the first papers issue, not because voters rejected women voting. On June 24, 1918, the Texas House voted for women's suffrage 96 to 21. 4 days later, the Senate also approved it, and Texas became the 9th state to ratify what would become the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and it was the first Southern state to do so. On July 29, 1919, the grandmother of women's suffrage in Tyler, Mary Louise Herndon, died, having seen women vote in primaries but not in general elections. Both she and Elizabeth Herndon Potter, as well as cousin Noni Boren Mahoney, a leading Dallas suffragette, are buried at Oakwood Cemetery. Bertie Johnson and Belle McFarland are at the crest of the hill at Rose Hill Cemetery. On August 19, 1920, Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment, and it became a part of the Constitution of the United States. Women now had an equal right to vote with men everywhere in the United States.